And good morning. I am Tamara Scott. Thank you for joining us on Tamara Scott Live as we bring you truth for our time, always helping you when the headlines hit home. And we talk about everything on this show because if God expects you to live through it, He's directed you how to do it. So everything from events, current events, holidays, issues. Dr. Alveda King called me on my way into the studio today, and she's spent a lot of time in St. Louis, Missouri. As you know, what's happening there with the verdict being brought down and some of the questionable timing of even releasing that verdict out amongst the people. She'll be coming to Iowa in January. On Martin Luther King Day, she'll be spending that evening with us and also some time with our legislators and community groups throughout the central Iowa area. So if you'd like to be a part of that, we'd certainly love to have you help with that. Concerned Women for America is the group that's heading that up, Concerned Women for America of Iowa, and you can reach them at director@iowa.cwfa.org. You can reach them there. And so also, as you know, I just returned from a trip from London and Poland and L.A., studying Margaret Thatcher, studying Reagan, studying John Paul II, and how God was raising up three individuals in separate countries, and yet together they would work to stop a Cold War before a shot was ever fired, and to bring hope to a people who were oppressed, who were under someone else's rule, and giving them the courage to fight back and to take their freedom and their liberty into their own hands, greatly changing Poland's history and their future since World War II, especially. So great trips that we've been on. My thanks to Ryan Northfield, my producer, for making that possible and keeping things going while I was gone. So we're going to take a break now, and we'll come back. We'll have Dr. Marshall Foster with us. Dr. Marshall Foster, formerly of the Mayflower Institute, now with worldhistoryinstitute.com, an expert on America's covenant, what brought us into being, what gave the Pilgrims and the folks from Scrooby, England, their courage to stand and create this great covenant, the Mayflower Compact, and all that we now hold dear. And we'll also talk about what possibly we need to be careful that we might not be able to hold in our grasp much longer if things don't change. So I'm looking forward to an exciting hour. Dr. Marshall Foster is giving us a whole hour. You can join in that conversation, 855-244-0077, 855-244-0077. And you can watch on webcast1live.com, obviously. When we come back from these commercials, you're going to hear us use our Restoring Hope banner. We'll be joining with our listeners from American Family Radio networks across the nation. So we'll take this break and we'll thank our sponsors and thank you for joining in with us. And we'll be right back after these messages.
From the RE/MAX Real Estate Concept Studios, this is Webcast One Live.
I'm Brian Leach, owner of Service Legends, and my position is Chief Talent Officer.
I'm Nicholas Wonderscheid.
I am Bernie Homs.
And I'm the Service Manager.
Marketing Director and Client Relations Manager.
Everything that we do is about ensuring that we exceed your expectations.
Our clients are important to us. 100% satisfaction.
We're not just focused on heating and cooling. That's the easiest part of our job, actually, is fixing furnaces and air conditioners.
Everyone that we come in touch with, we want to improve lives.
Bottom line is, we've got our installation guarantees, 25% energy savings guarantee, comfort guarantee, temperature selection guarantee, property protection guarantee.
100% satisfaction guaranteed. Fixed rate or it's free.
All of those guarantees are backed up with a 100% money-back guarantee to hold ourselves accountable to making sure that you get what you're after.
Just fixing the problem today. If they have another problem 5 days down the road, it's still fixed rate or it's free.
We use what's called straightforward pricing. Our technicians are going to give you an exact to-the-penny price on what it's going to take before they move forward with any repair. That way you know what to expect.
It's the same price every day.
No surprises.
If you get off work at 5 o'clock in the afternoon, you come home, you realize that, oh, my furnace is broken. Now you need to call somebody out that night. You shouldn't have to pay more for that.
We're guaranteeing service 24/7.
We run afternoons, evenings, nights, weekends. We're staffed to work that.
Phone rings at 3 in the morning. You'll get one of our representatives answering the phone every time.
We're not sending you out to Timbuktu in some call center. It's our Service Legend team members, our mission control team.
I'll take a call anytime.
And then they answer the phones the same way during the day as they do at night.
It's a great day at your service company. How can we make you smile?
That's the only way to provide true 24-hour service.
When you're able to let somebody actually live in their home safely when they weren't able to do that before, where they don't have to stay up at night and worry about, is the heat going to come back on? Are we going to freeze the pipes? Is the baby in the room next door going to be sick because they got too cold? When you're able to help somebody overcome challenges like that, that's impacting a life. That makes a difference. I get goosebumps thinking about it.
I love the team. I love the people that I work with.
We have fun, but we work hard.
I call them my ambassadors of legendary service. If you could just envision what that is, that's who we're sending to your home.
They literally will call in, pick up the phone and call and say, hey, I want to talk to your manager. And I get on the phone, they're like, that technician that was at my house was the greatest technician ever. That's cool to me.
We want to brighten people's days.
Every person that we have going into the house has gone through an extensive background check.
Drug testing, we have a very thorough interview process that 1 out of 140 people make it through.
If we promise you something, that's what you're going to get, no matter what.
We're here when you need us to protect the safety and comfort of your family.
If you're not happy, we're gonna make it right.
If we're willing to put 100% money back guarantee on what we do, what type of work do you think we do?
Give us a call. We're there for you 24/7, 365 days a year.
Enough said.
Restoring hope, open my heart to sing, taking the darkness inside, revealing your light, restoring hope.
And good day. Thank you for joining us. I am Tamara Scott, and we thank J. Michael McCoy for sharing his air with us on Restoring Hope. At Tamara Scott Live, you can always look to our archives on YouTube. You can find any of our shows that we've done over the past year or so at tamarascottlive.com. And my guest today is Dr. Marshall Foster from World History Institute. Dr. Marshall Foster will be talking about Thanksgiving. We'll be talking about America's covenant and America's future. And he's kindly given us an hour of discussion. Now, for those of you listening on the airwaves of radio, you'll have to go to that Tamara Scott Live archive to get the full hour, and you will want to, I know. And if you ever want to join us live as we tape this show, you can stop in at 10 a.m. Central Time Wednesday mornings, Webcast One Live, webcastonelive.com, where you can see us in production. You can call in, you can talk, you can, today we're Skyping with Dr. Marshall Foster, so it's like watching a TV without all the nasty commercials, really. So we'll hope that you can join us in future if you haven't done that for our webcast1.com productions thus far. We do need to thank our producers, our sponsors before we go further. Christians for America, Crave, the work that they do across the nation, actually restoring hope for individuals, talking about deliverance from life addictions, from behaviors that destroy. And so we thank them for coming alongside with us, as well as Webcast One Studios. And if you'd like to ever partner with us, you can find us on Facebook at Truth for Our Time, Facebook at Truth for Our Time. And we'd love to hear from you. J. Michael McCoy does a great job of talking about restoring hope personally, lifestyle-wise, and I come to you with restoring hope as a country, civically, politically. What do we need to do in our education systems? How can we help our communities? And so thank you for joining us. Dr. Marshall Foster, founder of what used to be the Mayflower Institute, for those of you who remember that name, now the World History Institute. You can find him at worldhistoryinstitute.com. He's written several books. He's also co-produced the movie with Kirk Cameron, that movie Monumental, and we are very appreciative to have his expertise in our studio today. Here we are filming the day before Thanksgiving. For those of you listening on air, you'll be hearing this after Thanksgiving, but good teaching for you just the same to tuck in your little hat and keep with you for your future generations. Make sure your kids know the truth of the holiday we're going to talk about today. Dr. Marshall Foster, thank you for joining me.
Tamara, it's always good to be with you.
Thank you. Did you know my producer is familiar with your work? He got to hear you in Omaha at one of the Providential History Festivals, and so he was very excited when he heard who my guest was today.
Wonderful. Yeah, it's a great time out there.
So, all right, so you've been doing this for some time, and I'm holding in my hand, for all of those who are watching online, the book, The American Covenant. I think that's now on video amongst the other tools that you have. I think, what is it, From Tyranny to Triumph? And several other tools you have for folks.
Right. Mm-hmm.
So,
the History of the World series called Terror to Triumph. Mm-hmm.
And then I think you've got another series that I just noticed that I don't think I have yet. Tell us about some of the resources you have for folks.
Well, Hope for Our Time is a 4-hour series on what is the hope, beginning with the 16th century. We give the history of America, its rise, its fall, why it fell, and how we can save it. That was done at the largest church in Denver a few years ago. And that's a great DVD series. And then I have a History of the World series, which is a overview from God's perspective of the great victory of God against tyrants and tyranny. And we track the history of the terrors of tyrants from the time of the Roman Empire through the rise and fall of the Nazis and into the 21st century. And it's an exciting series because what it does in a 12-half-hour period is that it gives the student or the listener an opportunity to see that good always does triumph over evil, and covenant keepers always win and covenant breakers always lose. You just have to stay around long enough to see the end of the story. And that's the real story.
And I like that. Covenant keepers always win, but that doesn't mean those who are complacent are included in that covenant keepers. For everybody out there who's listening who realizes something's happening in America, doesn't mean you can sit back and think covenant keepers are going to win. You better be part of that team that brings that victory forward. So, Dr. Foster, I want to talk here. I just returned from England and Poland, and while I was sitting in Poland in this beautiful art gallery, incredible art gallery, Governor Mike Huckabee was giving a speech, and behind him was a painting of Nero's torches, with those martyrs being burned at the stakes as his tortures. And I could only think of you and the work that you've done on martyrs in history throughout time, and was so pleased I already had you booked to come on the show on my return. I want to talk about Thanksgiving, but I want you to touch a little bit where we've come, because we don't just have Thanksgiving in America. It started 400 years ago.
That's right. And it started with persecution and death and despair and tyranny. And the thing that people lose context for, in America in the 21st century, we take for granted our lattes, we take for granted our freedom. But for the vast majority of people throughout the history of time, tyrants have ruled in nation after nation, civilization after civilization. And the only thing that broke that up, and this is the thing that people do not remember today, and it's our only hope as a country, is to come back to realize that it was God's idea in the beginning to bring liberty to the world. And he came to liberate the world, and he did through Christ. And if you see the development of Western civilization, you see the development of government, the development of law, the development of liberty, the development of free enterprise, all came out of believers who first were persecuted in the Roman Empire, then were persecuted as slaves like Patrick of Ireland, who went back after being a slave to the Druids for 6 years and converted an entire nation without war, without an army, in a period of 35 years, and set the stage for Western civilization, translating the classics and the Bible. And then the conversion of the miserable Scots from their paganism and how that happened. And then the development of the Angles and Saxons actually being transformed, so that instead of just eating one another and killing their enemies, these people began to follow the principles of common law, which was based upon the Ten Commandments. And that common law became the foundation of Magna Carta 800 years ago next year. And that Magna Carta was the foundation of the Mayflower Compact, which became the foundation for the United States Constitution. So to understand that chain of liberty, I call it the paper trail of freedom, is to understand where we come from and the bloody cost. It is a bloody paper trail because the martyrs had to pay the price by the thousands and by the millions against these tyrants, but they stood strong and they fought with truth, and over the generations they won.
So when we come to the idea of Thanksgiving, no longer taught in our schools, they can talk about Thanksgiving, but if they, of course, can't give thanks to God, give us the history for parents who are going to have time with their children, their grandchildren. Give us the details, the story that we need to be sharing that we don't allow to die.
This is so important, Tamara. This is the true story of Thanksgiving. It's not giving thanks to the Indians. That was not their purpose, although they were very thankful for their Indian friends. It was not giving thanks for the fact the rain came and it just happened to happen. It was giving thanks to Almighty God was the beginning of Thanksgiving. And the story behind that is an exciting story because in 1604, when this small band of separatists, outcasts in England who were not allowed to worship as they saw fit, they had to hide in a home and begin secretly to meet in Scrooby, England. When they did that, there was persecution all over the world. Tyrants ruled the world. 5 million people were dying in the 30 Years' War in Germany. Over 300,000 had been killed in the Netherlands by a maniac king from Spain. The King of England was James I, who wrote a book on divine right of kings, in which he said that it's the right of kings to tyrannize and tell their people whatever they want in terms of leadership, and you can't do anything about it because I'm divinely appointed. And so, as a result of this situation, it looked hopeless because the Pilgrims, a small group of 50 people in the middle of the wilderness of England, how are they possibly going to have an impact on anything? Well, they were persecuted out of England over the next 3 years, ended up in Holland, and in Holland they spent 11 years. And during those 11 years in exile, in the one place where they wouldn't be killed in the whole world, Holland had just recently turned to principles of liberty under the Bible. And the result was that they also sat under Hebrew scholars. And these Hebrew scholars, many of them former rabbis who had been persecuted in Spain and other places, they learned the principles of the ancient Torah and the principles of the Hebrew Republic and the principles of electing their representatives and their judges, the principles of local self-government as opposed to national power from the top down. All of these principles, and there are hundreds of them that are there, were taught to the Pilgrim Fathers. So by the time that these young separatists, who then, the flower of their congregation, seeing the persecution coming even to Holland, finally in 1620 got on a little ship and decided to come across into the wilderness of America and go to the area of Northern Virginia. Of course, they were blown 500 miles north of their intended destination, and they ended up outside of the King's Charter, and they ended up in Cape Cod. I always wondered why that was, that God gave the hook up there at Cape Cod. I thought, Kennedy Retreat Home, that's nice, but is that a real purpose? And then I thought, well, wait a minute, maybe that was the reason, because the Pilgrims ended up north of Cape Cod, and they kept trying to go south to New York, which was the place they were headed to be in the King's Charter, but they couldn't get past the shoals and the weather because it was November. And so they stopped in Cape Cod, looked for water for an entire month, and losing all hope, they came to a deserted village that no one knew existed, and they landed in this little teeny bay called Plymouth Harbor today. And there was a hill that had been cleared, and all the Native Americans in that area had been killed by a plague about 4 years before. No one lived there. They saw a beautiful stream, the only water in all of Cape Cod, and they said, this must be the place. They got off, 102 of them, and over the next several months, they built one shelter. Half of them died the first winter. They had to bury their dead in a common grave. And by the spring, it looked like there was little hope. Imagine going off. But they received their letter from their pastor, who had to leave them behind. And the pastor said this to them when they could have given up hope, that how are they going to survive here in the wilderness? This is a hopeless adventure. The captain said, get back on the Mayflower. I'll take you back to England. It's your only hope of survival. Half of you are dead already. The pastor wrote this: thus this holy army of saints is marshaled here on earth by these officers under the conduct of their glorious Emperor Christ. Thus it marshals in this most heavenly order and glorious array against all enemies, both bodily and ghostly, peaceful as Jerusalem, but terrible to the enemy as an army with banners, triumphing over their tyranny with patience, their cruelty with meekness, and over death itself with dying. What you see here is a pastor who then goes on to say, you are my army, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against you. This is the kind of optimism that John Robinson, the Pilgrim pastor, had for that small little group. that then went on after the spring of that year. Everyone that survived the first winter lived into their 60s and 70s. Those people went on even surviving 2 years under communism. Most people don't know that they were forced into a socialistic communism by the adventurers who had put up the money for the ship. And as a result, they ended up not being very successful the first 2 years. In fact, they were starving to death. And it was at that time, in the summer of 1623, that they turned to free enterprise. And William Bradford became their governor when the governor died. And William Bradford, who was their governor then for 30 years and wrote the only true history of the Pilgrim Fathers, called Of Plymouth Plantation, he said, if a man does not work, he shall not eat. Every man should have his own plot of land and work it instead of working our lands in common. And if we do that, we'll be successful. And sure enough, he divided all the lands. And when men began to work on their own land instead of common lands, guess what happened? Great prosperity began to spring up. Their corn began to grow. It was great, except the rains didn't come in July and August, and there were no sprinkler systems. And so with no rain, the corn was dying on the vine. They couldn't eat it. They were going to starve that fall. And so they realized there was one thing missing. They had turned to the right principles of free enterprise and individual ownership, but they had not given God the glory. They had not given thanks to God. So they had a day of repentance and prayer. And on that day, at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, the rain began to come. And for 3 days, gentle rain fell, resurrected their crops at the last minute, so that by the fall harvest, they were well supplied. So it was in the fall of 1623 that the first real Thanksgiving was held. And it was a thanksgiving to God for bringing the rain, thanksgiving to God for free enterprise, thanksgiving to God for a free country, and for their friendship with their Native American friends, which lasted, by the way, 50 years. That was the first Thanksgiving in America. And even to this day, almost 400 years later, that Thanksgiving has become the great holiday of America. We're one of only 2 nations that has a Thanksgiving. Canada has followed our lead. Other than that, no other nation has a national Thanksgiving. Why do we have it? I believe it's because we know in our hearts of hearts, we know that it's not just in God we trust on our coins. It's not just that the Declaration of Independence says, with firm reliance upon divine providence, we pledge our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor. But our people know in their hearts that it is God Almighty that has given us our liberty. They just have lost that perspective at the educational level. They don't know it. They know it in their guts. They know it from their grandfathers. They sense it, that there was something grand that is beyond themselves. And of course it is. And if we give thanks to Almighty God, I believe that's our strength. We stop giving thanks.
Dr. Marshall Foster is my guest. You can find him at worldhistoryinstitute.com. And Dr. Foster, what you're saying is such wonderful news. And, you know, I knew bits and parts of it growing up, but certainly not the depth that you can share. For all of those folks who may be listening, where did you find your information? How do you give credibility to that story? So when they talk to people and people want to give them pushback, what can they give for proof?
Well, it's interesting. The modern, and I mean very modern, in the 30, 40 years, no one had the guts to attack the historicity of the Pilgrim story until this last generation. And now you've got secular humanists who have moved in and begun to do that. But the true facts are, here, for example, is William Bradford's original history called Of Plymouth Plantation. This was written in his own hand, rediscovered 100 years later, and this is the only true history of the Pilgrims. We learned from 1603 until 1640 exactly what took place there in Plymouth, and no one disputes that this is the true story of the Pilgrim Fathers. So I would encourage your listeners, this is not only true of the Pilgrims, but it's true of all of American history and world history, to go back to the original sources and go back and find out what people actually said and what they did, rather than listen to especially modern brute fact historians, most of whom come from a very warped perspective in terms of their view of history.
And after having just traveled the trip that I did and hearing that it was the academic, the elite, the intellectuals who were responsible for creating death camps, creating the best way possible to exterminate a mass number of people. It was the intellectual elite who did that to their fellow man at Auschwitz, at Birkenau, and at several other concentration and death camps across that part of Europe. And so, Dr. Foster, how important it is for us to return and force as parents in our communities. You must force your public schools to tell the truth of what is going on. Because when you remove God, I'm sure Dr. Foster can tell you more examples than I can, but when you remove God, you bring in calamity, desperation, destruction, and death, undoubtedly, in countries. Would you say that's a true statement, Dr. Foster?
Oh, absolutely true. In fact, I'm so excited you had the opportunity to go to Poland. I was there several times. I've been 7 times to Europe, and in one of my trips in 2001, I got a chance to meet Christian Führer, who was the man who led the prayer meetings in East Germany, which brought down the Berlin Wall, which is the other facet. As you were saying, there were 3 great heroes of bringing down the Soviet Union, and probably the greatest hero of bringing down the Berlin Wall, which really set it on track, was a man named Christian Führer, who was a Lutheran pastor who began a prayer meeting at 5 o'clock in 1982. When everybody thought the Soviet Union was going to last forever, he started a prayer meeting in a huge cathedral in Leipzig, Germany. And for 7 years, he had his people praying for freedom and lighting candles, 40 candles for the years in exile of the Jews, saying, isn't it long enough that we've been in bondage, first to the Nazis and now to the Russians? And they cried out to God every Monday at 5 o'clock. He was pushed into the snow to kill him by the GDR. He and his people lost their jobs, and yet they kept praying, finally till October 6th of 1989, where 200,000 people gathered outside of his church, and they passed out candles and marched on the tanks in Leipzig and saw them down, so that the actual German soldiers who were fighting for the Russians dropped their weapons, picked up candles, and turned on the Russians. That was the fall of the Berlin Wall. And I think that's what we have to see. It's the heart of a people. We get the form of government that we resemble, not the form of government that we want. And if we, the people, will rise up and we will trust in God and we will stand with him and be thankful to him and understand his principles, then we become any tyrant or any tyranny.
I didn't realize that was going to be the correlation, but it's so moving to me, having just been back from Poland. And you're absolutely right. It was in Poland, the heart of the people. It was John Paul II speaking. And as only God can do, he had the first pope who was not Italian, but from Poland. And the government there, the Soviet, the communistic government, could not stop a native pope from Poland from speaking. When he spoke on that piece of grass that we stood, 2.5 million people joined him against their government's wishes. They wouldn't leave. They sung hymns. They broke out in spontaneous song of hymns, and he charged them. He asked them not to fear man, but to put their faith in God and to trust Jesus Christ for their salvation. And he gave them a freedom much greater. 2 Corinthians 3:17 talks about where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is liberty. He gave them much greater hope than what they could have ever had, and he gave them the courage to stand against their own government. It was not without bloodshed, and it was not with ease, but they were able to overcome, just as you're talking about in Berlin. And we've got to go to break here shortly, but I tell you, we'll continue our discussion on webcast1.live, webcast1live.com, and then you can get the archive available, Tamara Scott Live on YouTube. Look for the day's date. We're taping this on November 26th, and so you can get today's date. Dr. Marshall Foster's name will be at the top of the email as well, at the top of the link, and you can get that information. And I want to, again, tell you, Dr. Alveda King will be in Iowa for those of you listening on air. If you want to be a part of that, we'd love to have you help in some way. Concerned Women for America is bringing her in so we can build relationships with our communities, racial communities coming together to understand the liberty and the freedom that Christ has given to each and every one of us, not just a group, but each and every one of us. And we can't allow government to pit us apart, to put us in groups that isolate us because, and we'll talk about this when we come back from our break with Dr. Foster, but God grants us power. We hear it in the phrase from Lincoln, we the people, by the people, for the people. God grants us power as individuals. And we put that in our groups, it isolates us, it paralyzes us, and it polarizes us from each other, and we can't move forward. So we're going to continue this conversation, figure out how we can move forward in America. I thank you for joining us on this radio show. I thank Webcast One Live for the studio and Restoring Hope for the airtime. But I hope you'll join us and learn more about us on Truth for Our Time on Facebook, and join us. Stay tuned for the Tamara Scott Live Archive with Dr. Marshall Foster. We'll be right back after these messages. For those of you out there, this is your time. Our nation is at stake. You cannot afford to sit back. You heard Dr. Marshall talk about the covenant keepers. You, if you've heard this message, should join. That is you, not anyone else. Be encouraged. Never be complacent.
Credit cards are like grandkids. They love you, sometimes get out of control, and it's fun to get a new one. Who can stop them from piling on?
Hi, I'm Tom Coates with Consumer Credit of Des Moines. At the end of the day, you can return the grandkids, but you're stuck paying off bad credit card debt. We'll help you put the fun back into using credit cards responsibly. Right, kids? Yeah!
If you need help getting credit cards off your back, call Consumer Credit of Des Moines.
Hey, psst. Let me let you in on a little secret. You ready? Always try to do business with people, not places. Especially if you seek honest Christian business people. And when it comes to my car, I really need to trust who's working on it. Now, my family is so blessed. A few years ago, we found a family-owned automobile repair shop that operates as a Christian business also. Open, honest, reliable, trustworthy. It's AMCO on Hickman Road in front of Kmart. And it's a family-owned Christian operating business. This family treats your car as if it was their car. Everything from oil changes to transmission repair and everything in between. So the next time you feel the need to be at peace with your choice of who you can trust with your car, give AMCO on Hickman a chance to serve you. And tell them Max sent.
And thanks for staying tuned with us. I'm talking with Dr. Marshall Foster. If you'd like to join in the conversation, you are welcome. 855-244-0077, 855-244-0077. Maybe you have a question on some of the topics we've been talking about. Dr. Marshall Foster, thank you for staying with me. You were talking about the fact that when the Pilgrims decided to start this journey 400 years ago, there was a plague, there was Christian persecution, there was tyranny. And I have to say, other than the plague, although we do now have Ebola concerns, I'm not sure how much of a plague that really truly is, but to me, when I hear that, it sounds very similar to what we're dealing with today. Christians are being persecuted horrifically in the Middle East. We're now getting our religious freedoms oppressed and removed here in the States. We have a couple right here in Des Moines, Iowa, who have their lovely little restaurant. The Gortz House Art Gallery is being charged because they didn't refuse anyone else their rights. They just declined to participate in a same-sex marriage, and now they've been taken to court and could lose everything for their retirement. So we see religious freedom persecuted. We see tyranny. We see tyranny with our own president, what's happening with his unconstitutional act on the border and illegal immigration, and his refusal to go with the process of 3 branches of government. And we see administrative law taking over, bureaucracies, and taking and adding laws. Some 3,800 laws have been added since 2012, not passed through the legislative process in the state or the federal level, but added through regulations and rules and bureaucracy. That Magna Carta that you talked about, Marshall Foster, we are now handing back over a rule to a king voluntarily in this nation. It makes no sense to me. So when we think we're hopeless here in America, you give us hope that this is basically what's happening in Europe when the Pilgrims set free.
Exactly. And what we find in history is that it's always been an against all odds story. It looks like tyrants win because they're power mongers. They win through temporally through intimidation, torture, death, like the Roman emperors. But in the long run, the Roman emperors lost because they torched the Christians, and because the Christians kept feeding the poor, caring for the needy, picking up the aborted babies that were left out to be eaten by the wolves, and taking them down to the catacombs and evangelizing and reaching people, giving them hope in their lives, and picking up the women who were dying in the plague and nursing them back to health to die themselves. This happened all over the Roman Empire for 300 years. What was the result? Much of the empire was converted to Christianity and gave up their pagan gods. And the emperors couldn't control it until finally reached Emperor Constantine in 313 AD, had to declare Christianity the rule of the day. And so why? Because the transformation of heart and mind that takes place in the hearts of people at times of persecution. Let me give you one quote from C.S. Lewis that I think that emphasizes your point. We tend to think of our time as the crisis of the ages. C.S. Lewis called this self-centered thinking chronological snobbery. And that's the sense that I think many, especially in the millennial generation, have got a sense that our generation is better. We live in the technological age now. It's all Facebook and good times and YouTube, and everything happens instantaneously. So we live in an existential moment. Who cares about the past? Well, this existentialism is costing us dearly, because the truth is there's been this building of liberty for 5,000 years of recorded history. And that story, when it's told, gives us great hope, because at the times when we begin to lose our liberty, we begin to lose our freedom, and we turn our back on God, it's that time that he gently disciplines us with our own mistakes. Because when we turn to socialism, socialism doesn't work. When we turn to a tyrant, the tyrant doesn't feed us, he simply enslaves us. That has been the history of every tyrant in the history of mankind, and it will be true in America again today if we continue on this path. But what God does here is that he gives us opportunity to say, wait, turn around. Remember, I am the loving God who wants to give you freedom. Jesus said, I have come to set the captives free, those that are in prison free. Racial integration, he was all for it. He was the founder of it. Women's rights, it was Christ and the Bible that gives us women's rights and children's rights and morality and character and law that is 10 commandments rather than 10,000 commandments, which is the modern state. And so how do we get there? We get there doing it God's way, from the inside out, the Pilgrim way. That's why Kirk Cameron and I did a movie called Monumental a few years ago, and worked on it for several years before that. And it was based in Plymouth, and it's the story not only of the Pilgrims, but of the strategy to restore and rebuild America. I recommend it. You can get it on my website, worldhistoryinstitute.com. It is great for Thanksgiving. It's great at any time, because it tells the strategy to restore any nation to liberty. And it's an 80-ton monument sitting over the harbor in Plymouth that is totally forgotten. The largest granite monument in America, called the Forefathers Monument. And if you go through the monument, you can go on YouTube, you can see Kirk and I telling it through. You can go and get the movie. We walk around the monument, and it tells us what to do to restore our nation. And it doesn't start with top down, take out the bad guy, put in a good guy, and he puts up a big neon sign that we're all going to go back to God. No, it starts down here in the home, in the family, in the precinct, in the community, caring for the needy, the poor, race relations, dealing with it at that level. That's covenant keeping. That's what the founders did. That's what the Bible calls for. And if we'll do it that way, from the inside out, then the monument goes and gives us the details of how we develop morality and Christian biblically based laws. And then we educate our own children for the generations to come. And then we become liberty heroes. And it has this giant 16-ton statue of a liberty hero sitting in full Roman toga. And he's got his weapon sheathed, and he's sitting looking back at England saying, we will no longer live in tyranny. And you see, if you want to be strong for liberty, you first got to be strong with your wife, with your children, with your faith in God, with your faith in his moral and biblical principles. If that is happening in your life, then you become strong and able to stand against any tyrant that would come against your liberty.
And I think the other thing that comes with that, when you get your faith right, when you stand in the Word of God and you fully understand that nothing happens to you that hasn't first passed through the hand of Jesus Christ. He's got you in His care. When you're living in obedience to His Word, He will keep you in His care, and nothing will impact you, touch you. You will not face anything that He hasn't first allowed, and He will see, and He will see you through. But we forget that. And so unless we're right spiritually, do we have that confidence then to go forward and challenge a government or to challenge the negatives in our community? Because there will be pushback. There is resistance. But when you understand that, that resistance no longer really matters like it would without that understanding. When you know that you're in the hand of an almighty God and you're doing His will and His work. Dr. Foster, you had mentioned that America was a socialist nation before we were ever a nation, actually. Take us through that just briefly, because we've already tried, you're right, we've already tried socialism in this country, and it was found wanting and desperate, and people were dying because of it.
That's right. In fact, in Bradford's history, here's the history of the Pilgrims, he actually uses that word, communism. He says, do we think that we're wiser than the ancients? He says that we would live in common. He says the women don't like doing the underwear, washing the underwear of the other husbands that are in the colony. They don't like doing communal work. And he gives that as an illustration. He said, if a man does not, and then he quotes the scripture, if a man does not work, he shall not eat. And the illustration, of course, private property from the Ten Commandments. It's interesting, the Ten Commandments deal specifically with the family and private property. The last 6 commandments, the first 4 deal with honoring God. Last 6 protect private property, free enterprise, not lusting after someone's goods or someone's wife, or killing, taking away their life, which would be their ultimate property. And so once you come back to those basic biblical principles, you can't live in a communist world. Because a communist world is built upon the idea that there is no sin in the world, that all men will just get along. Hey, isn't it great? That's why I'm not a libertarian. A true libertarian who has no foundation in biblical truth would be one who says, hey, everybody's going to be fine if everybody just gets along and does their own thing. No, men won't do their own thing unless they have a higher source. Who tells them there has to be a higher source to law and to liberty and to truth. And the Pilgrims had that. So in 1623, after 2 years of starving to death, where they couldn't get their fields out there because the people that worked hard were few, and those that watched the people work hard were many. You know how it goes. If you have a socialist welfare state in which you can get 5 or 10% of the people to pay the taxes, and I can get the benefits, hey, listen, why should I do the work?
Yep.
And so that's what happened to them, because it's true of it's human nature. And so, but when men were put on their own piece of land and said, if you do not work this land, you will not eat. Oh, they were out there working great, and prosperity for all grew within a couple of years.
And not only were they able to provide for themselves, and they had extra that they could trade and share and then prosper.
Exactly. And they were then able to spend the time not only surviving. Most people in the world, you look at the world in the Middle East, you look at it in most of Africa and much of Asia, people spend their day just trying to get enough food to go the next day. But in reality, with free enterprise, you get beyond that. And our founding fathers understood that. It was the leisure middle class, is what Thomas Jefferson said would be the foundation of our liberty, because he said they are the most accountable. Somebody who then is a free enterpriser, who then does more than take care of his own, he then can give to the poor and the needy. He can provide the charity of the society. By the way, that's what the church and the individual did in America until the 1930s. And so, and then he is the one who then has the time to get involved in government and to hold the tyrant's feet down to the fire. So the key here is, free enterprise will not exist if we just come at it from the perspective, I'm going to get mine and go. It only works when it's in a unified system of caring, loving, sharing, and doing it God's way, as it were. If we do, then there will be liberty and justice, and we will help others to develop their own businesses, and free enterprise will grow. So that's what happened with the Pilgrim Fathers. And there has not been a day of famine in America since 1623. Think about it. America has been the most blessed economic nation in the history of the world. Not only were they able to do that, but they formed a biblical government through the Mayflower Compact on November 11, 1620, on that ship, which is a covenantal compact theory of government, which was then copied by the Massachusetts colony, Connecticut colony. The Connecticut colony wrote a constitution which became the foundation for the American Constitution 150 years later. And all of the colonies followed that same covenantal biblical pattern of obeying God, having private property, holding their local governments accountable to only do a small thing, which is simply make sure everyone obeys the law. And apart from that, everything is left up to the individual and to the church and to the private charities to take care of society. And it worked great for 200 years.
And when we have that, I think we have more unity than we do when we try to push the communism. In the communism, somebody's always afraid that somebody else is getting their piece of the pie. But when you earn it and it's yours, you know what is yours. And you have the control over it, of what you share, what you give to charity, and what you don't. And in the biblical context of that is we're called to tithe as a Christian. As a church, we're called to care for the poor, the sick, the needy. But when the government does it, that's your tax. Your tax dollar is different than your tithe dollar. And when your tax dollar, it's forced, it's coerced, it's not a generous gift. When I do it through my tithe and my charity, God can bless me or he can correct me by my generosity or my stinginess. But if I do it through the government, I lose that ability to be blessed or corrected by God because it's coerced. And it will never work. We've seen the fraud, the inefficiencies in healthcare, welfare systems. It will never work, and it will never be as efficient. And I believe totally because it's out of God's parameters, and that Romans separation of church and state, that is not in the Constitution, but is in the Bible, that separation of church and state, where he gives us our definitive rules. Government is only to punish the bad and uphold the good. That is all government is supposed to do. It's far too involved in all of our lives these days. And Marshall Foster's absolutely right, as he said in the first segment of our show. You want to see things improve them at home first. When the family's healthy, society benefits. When the family's broken, society pays the cost through phenomenal expenses of welfare, whether it's prison, whether it's drug issues, whether it's runaways, whatever the issues are, education-wise, kids suffer. Society pays the cost when the family is not healthy. So if you want to see things improve in your community, start it at home. When we get things right in our house, in God's house, they will then be right in the state house, the courthouse, the schoolhouse. But not until we get them right in our house. You're absolutely right about that, Marshall Foster. I want to ask you another question, somewhat related, but a little bit different tract. King James I, in one of the newsletters you sent out, you talk a little bit about King James I and his persecution against those who disagreed with him. Is that the same King James that many people refer to as the King James Bible?
Oh, yes, it is. But I think we have to understand the man. The man was, he lost his faith if he had one coming out of Scotland. And at 36 years old, he was brought down to become the King of England. Never went back to Scotland. And when he kind of left that faith, and when he took over the kingship of England, he became a divine right tyrant. He thought of himself as a theologian. And so he would dictate things. He would write letters. But he told people how to believe and what to think. So he believed in the divine right of kings to do anything. And he misinterpreted Romans 13, which had been a plague of the Middle Ages, because when people misinterpret the Bible, they use it for their own means, don't they? And that's what exactly the kings did. They said, oh, obey rulers and authorities, and they made that absolute. Of course, the Bible doesn't make it absolute. It says specifically that those in control have an accountability to God and to the people, and that they are always accountable to an ultimate source, who is God, who then will hold them accountable through lesser magistrates if they go mad. So if a king goes mad, he can be taken from his throne. And that's the basis of the American Revolution. The Founding Fathers understood this over a period of 150 years, from the time of King James to the time of the Revolution. Great Christian authors wrote biblical treatises on Romans 13, like Lex Rex from Samuel Rutherford, who was a Scottish theologian. The result is the Founding Fathers read that and they said, wait a minute, God is sovereign, the king is not. And if the king, goes in and boards his troops in our houses and steals our land and takes away our weapons, he has lost his right because he has broken his covenant with the people, his own laws, and he is now ruling as a tyrant. The word tyrant meaning one who rules without the sanction of God. And so he is outside of the sanction, and just like a father who would abuse his children, he can be taken from the home. So a ruler who abuses his country to the extreme can have lesser magistrates rise up and take him from power. And so that was the basis of America's liberty, and it was based upon the biblical principle of accountability, covenantal relationships. There's no such thing as one man better than another, or one ruler having absolute authority to do whatever he wants. That ruler is always, always, always accountable to the rules of God.
And the years King James were the first was in ruling was what? When was that?
1603 to 1625. And during that time, he persecuted anybody that disagreed with him. Now, he did have a group of scholars, Puritan scholars, write the Bible called the King James Bible. Now, the King James Bible, just to give you an idea, this is the Geneva Bible. This is the Bible. I had a privilege of bringing this back into print. It's been out of print for 400 years. Why? Because King James wouldn't allow it to be printed anymore. This is the original Bible that William Tyndale and then his followers and scholars like John Knox and John Calvin printed this in English, but because of the tyrants, they wouldn't let it in. Finally, Elizabeth, who came right before James, Elizabeth allowed 6,000 copies to come back in. The people of England read this Geneva Bible, and it changed their belief in the absolute sovereignty of God over the king. So when King James came in, he said, I want a Bible of my own. He took 88% of this Bible, the King James Bible, 50 years before. He had some scholars come in, and he wrote a very good version called the King James Bible, a little bit more modern English, but he made sure there were no notes. This has 200,000 notes in it from scholars, and nothing in it about tyranny or tyrants. He said, is the word tyrant not used in my version? He said, no, it's not, sir. They made sure there was no use of the word tyrant. Why? Because he was afraid of the fact that the Bible clearly teaches that if you are the handmaiden in Egypt, you do not give over the children to be killed. You actually hide them or put them in the reeds. And that was a good thing that they did. And so throughout the scripture, there are places where tyrants are not obeyed and they are called tyrants, and he didn't like that. So there's good and bad, but basically the King James Bible is a good Bible, but it had nothing to do with him. He didn't write it. It was just a group of scholars who basically improved the language of the Geneva Bible.
And wrote it maybe under his commission. So now you're talking about tyrants. You're talking about when we don't have a faith in God, when we don't look to an almighty being. And to me, I think it's so incredibly arrogant for people to denounce a faith in Christ or proclaim their atheism or their agnosticism as if it's somehow righteous, because what that does is says, myself, I'm greater, I know better than these 5,000 years of history. And so I find that incredibly arrogant, but that's what happens. And so when we have the tyrants, you see that it's whoever has the power or the cash or the military, they rule, not a better good or a biblical principle. I'd much rather answer to a God Almighty, who we can see in His Word and see how fair and just He is, than the human nature of any man when he has too much power. Exactly.
Ronald Reagan said it. So did Margaret Thatcher. Ronald Reagan said, there are only 10 commandments, but there are 1,837 regulations on how you can clean cabbage in the Department of Agriculture. So, what he says is that, we've got regulations that will control our life, or we will have the simple commandments of God who will give us direction. Which way do you want to go? Because regulation will always enslave you. Remember, the power to license is the power to control. And that's what's happened. We have allowed the bureaucrats and bureaucracy to literally clamp down on our liberty. We live in a soft tyranny today. We think we live free, but in reality, our lives are governed, every detail of it, by a bureaucracy that is leading us to a complete tyranny.
And as someone who's involved in the political process as a national committee woman for Iowa, this is something that bothers me greatly because we are putting far too much emphasis on the political realm and towards government and even to the electing of those officials. And so I'd really like to see us get back to limited government, honest, true, limited government, and the freedom and liberties of the people. Saying that, we have a president who has just recently proclaimed his unconstitutional act of he's going to bypass Congress. We only have a short time left, but give our listeners and our viewers instruction. Is this something we just have to sit back and go, wow, that's tough? Or do we have recourse as a people?
Well, of course we do. And I think it begins not with the national, although, of course, electing national leaders who are godly is very important. And it doesn't even begin at the state level. It begins at the county and the city level. That Hugo Grotius said it well 400 years ago when he said, a man who wants to be king first has to learn how to rule a province, and from a province he has to learn to rule a city, and first he has to learn to rule his family, and how can he rule a family unless he be ruled by God? And so what it is, it comes down to individually in our own lives, it starts there. The Shema of Deuteronomy 6 sets the strategy of how we can take back any country, where it says we are to love God, we are to know God and love God, and then train our children in the morning when we rise up and throughout the day and into the evening. Then it says we are to have hospitality from the porch of our home to the gates of the city. And that's how dominion goes. Dominion does not start at the top, it starts at the bottom. So if we want to see America transformed, then, and I'm working on that nationwide with cities like Castle Rock, Colorado, and many cities, and of course states like Oklahoma and others, that are beginning to see a complete biblical worldview worked out in terms of their governmental strategy. But go back to the city level and the county level, and you can take over the school board. You can work at the local level. Then you can get the local churches involved in charity and giving and reaching out to the needy and the poor and the unwed mothers and others, so that we can take away the power of government through our love and through our money and through our involvement. And we are the largest single minority in the country. We talk about minorities. The largest single minority, which is by far the biggest, are those that believe in God and Jesus Christ. It is the largest minority. So if we, the believers in America, would live our faith and would do it in a biblical manner, caring and keeping those separation of powers that you talked about, where we take care of the things that God's called us to take care of, our children. The education of our children is our responsibility, not the state.
Right.
And it is the responsibility for us to make sure what goes into their minds and their hearts and how they eat and whether we feed the poor or not. Feeding the poor is important. Then let's get the Church of Jesus Christ doing it. And as we do that progressively, we can then do away with the need for a socialist bureaucracy that bribes us from the top, saying we'll do it instead of you, the church, doing it.
And so it's all very good word. Dr. Marshall Foster is my guest. Dr. Marshall Foster is with worldhistoryinstitute.com, worldhistoryinstitute.com. You can find him there. You can contact us at Truth for Our Time on Facebook. You can watch any of these archives available at Tamara Scott Live on YouTube. And we'd love to hear from you. We'd love to hear your input. And Dr. Foster, if you'll stay on the phone just a little bit after we get off the air, I want to talk to you about a project I'm working on moving forward, as you say, in our communities, but also politically as well. And so I thank those of you who've listened in today. And I appreciate that you've given us your time, and I hope you've found good information that you can use. Again, Dr. Marshall Foster's website is worldhistoryinstitute.com, and good resources for you. I invite you to go and watch, order the movies so you can watch them with your family. Talk to your children. I don't care how old they are. Talk to your kids and your grandkids. I will be at Thanksgiving around the table. My kids know it. We will be discussing these very things. And so train up that next generation to honor God, that we might have a country that honors him, that he can honor his covenant with us as a nation. Thank you, Dr. Marshall Foster. I am Tamara Scott. Be encouraged and never be complacent.